I think we can all agree that dolls, whether they be made of cloth, porcelain, or any kind of fabric, are as creepy as all hell. While it is different for everybody, the whole aspect of dolls themselves are genuinely a creepy concept that's been tormenting our nightmares for years on end. Try and think back on a time in your life where you came across a doll, any kind of doll, and tell me that you didn't at least get some kind of nightmare from it. Very likely you had one, all because of that damn doll. Honestly, I never really even understood the whole appeal that dolls give to people in the first place. I mean, sure, they provide some sort of entertainment for younger kids, but think about how you or any of your family members used to play with those things. It was genuinely a rather creepy experience, was it not? I mean, with the idea of someone much bigger than those little things, making them talk, making them do things, putting them into various doll houses and the like, it's like a creepy god complex that tends to come over nearly everybody, and honestly, it's kind of psychotic. Then again, the people who are playing with these things are usually kids, so I guess that might be a bit of a stretch to actually label them like that. However, you can't deny the fact that it's still unnerving. Speaking of unnerving, why is it that many dolls are made to look as realistic as they possibly can? That I don't get how anybody, child or adult, can enjoy looking at, much less playing with it all the time. I mean, their glass eyes seem to follow you whenever you go, and even though you know full on fact that that's not the case, and don't even get me started on how they look like at night. Dear God, that image alone is enough to keep sleep away from anybody for years on end. As you very likely have expected, I hate dolls. In fact, I found them to be one of the most abysmal things ever created on God's green earth. Whoever thought that making something that stares at you in your sleep and never really does anything, or God forbid talks, is honestly a complete and utter and insane nut job that deserves to be locked up for life. Of course, because of that phobia that I have of all of these things, my childhood was rather odd. In fact, I'd even go so far to say that it was nearly close to being non-existent. Granted, there were other reasons as to why this was the case, but dolls were one of the major reasons why I ultimately didn't exactly have too much of a childhood. As expected, my time watching television was limited because of my fear, and the one show that actually shockingly managed to really solidify my hatred for those little abominations from the deepest, darkest depths of hell was a show by the name of Max and Ruby. Okay, I know I need to explain myself here. And yes, I know that what I just said was probably one of the stupidest things anybody could have said. What's so scary about a show about rabbits? The answer to that question is nothing, with the sole exception of Ruby's little collection she has. In fact, I can honestly admit that I really had nothing to do with the show for a very long time, and even nowadays, primarily because of the reason of. Primarily because of those dolls. So, if that was only the case, then why am I even bothering with this post? That's the thing though. One of these episodes that I had watched was primarily the reason why not only I've never been able to get over my phobia, but a good reasoning why I don't really like watching the show. Now, before I actually dive into what I can recall with this episode, I want to let everyone know that while I genuinely do believe that I saw this episode, I am opening to finding out the truth on whether or not this episode existed or not. I mean, there is a thing called false memories that tend to pop up in many people's heads. Don't deny it, it's happened to you. And maybe this episode was just one of them, albeit a very long one. So please, I ask all of you to take what I saw with a grain of salt, and look into it in your own time. If I am proven wrong, then thank God. But if I've been proven right, well, fuck. I believe this episode aired around the time that I was around 9 or so, at least as far as I can remember. why I was watching this episode around my age is something that I actually do remember. From what I can recall, my mother and my father were relatively busy that day doing some work from home. And because of this, I wasn't able to go outside and play due to there being no adult supervision to kind of watch me. So out of sheer defeat and boredom, I had made my way over towards the living room television and began switching it over to a bunch of channels until I finally landed on Nickelodeon, only to be bombarded with various advertisements pointing out the new shows that were coming on Nick Jr. I remembered skipping that channel and looking for something else to watch. Honestly, the last thing that I really wanted to watch that day was a bunch of shows aimed more for preschoolers. Unfortunately, as I scrolled through the channels, there really wasn't much anything that interested me. So I pretty much, more out of boredom than anything, flipped back to Nick Jr., only to have my ears nearly blasted off of my head with the sudden blaring of the middle of the Max and Ruby theme song. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I have seen a few episodes of the show, so I have a vague familiarity to what usually went on during it. Specifically with Ruby planning or doing something, Max screwing it up, and then for some reason, because of Max or because of Ruby or whoever, everything ultimately works out in the end. Basically, that's the show in a nutshell. So I knew not to have an extreme amount of expectations for whatever episode was going to come on that day. That is, until the title of the episode was shown at the very start of the episode. Ruby's Dollhouse. Yes, as you'd expect, I started to click away from the episode. However, during my process, my dad wound up barging into the living room, grabbed the remote out of my hand, and then switched it back to Nick Jr. Then he proceeded to ask me, in a rather irritated tone, what my problem was. The only thing that I was able to spit out at the time, due to me having an irrational fear of my father as well, was something about dolls. To which my father basically told me to stop being such a wuss, man up, and get over my fear of stupid dolls. Yeah, he was very cold with me at the time. But I honestly think it was because of the stress of his job, though thinking back on it, he's always been cold. So after my lecture, he basically wound up taking the remote back with him to the office, and I was pretty much left sitting there, stuck watching the episode. Now, as for the episode itself, while I can't really recall every little detail that went on with it, I do remember at least a small chunk of it. At least as best as I can remember, which I guess is a good thing for me. The episode itself started off rather simply, with Ruby in her bedroom setting up, or in this case, building, a large doll house in her room. Most likely for her dolls. It was then that after a few more moments of Ruby setting up the rest of the dollhouse by putting the roof on top of it, it was apparently completed. She then proceeded to talk to herself a bit about making the dollhouse and how it was a lot of work, but how it was ultimately worth it. And then, after that, she started putting up some of the fake furniture inside of the newly created dollhouse. This lasted for only a few moments before Max would then barge into her room and then ask Ruby, in his simple one-worded dialogue, that he was hungry. Ruby seemed a bit agitated at first, but calmed down and then went down to the kitchen with Max to make him a peanut butter and banana sandwich. However, just before the scene cut to the kitchen, the camera quickly panned over towards the various dolls that Ruby had in her room, staring directly at the screen for just a few moments, due to the angle that the camera was at. This lasted for only a few seconds before finally cutting to the next scene. Obviously, looking at that scene, it scared me a good bit at the time. But given how it was so short, I actually continued on watching the thing, hoping and praying that I wouldn't have to see anything like that. Honestly, I really would have been perfectly fine with watching Max do whatever it was that he did in the show, if it only meant sitting there and not actually having to watch that. But of course, as the episode continued and Max was finally back in his room playing with his toys, the scene would of course cut back to Ruby playing with her dolls in the makeshift dollhouse. Now, I don't really recall whether or not if there was an honest plot to this episode. Very likely there was. I probably wasn't paying much attention. But even if there was or there wasn't, I do remember that most of the episode was primarily focused on the dolls that were shown, and well, as the episode progressed. This ultimately wound up causing me a lot more anxiety as I continued on watching the episode. However, the final straw to this episode for me, at least to my 9-year-old self, was around the final few minutes I think the episode had. As Ruby was playing with her dolls, I believe she was having a tea party with them in the dollhouse itself, Max would, for the third time in that episode, interrupt Ruby with something ridiculous. Which, if I can remember, was him being hungry again. Ruby would then get up from her spot without a single word and then go and take Max to go and do whatever the heck it was that he wanted to do. What it was, again, it was him being hungry, but I don't know what happened after that point. In fact, the rest of the episode itself is completely and utterly blank from my mind because of this one scene. The one thing that I actually do wind up recalling before I wound up losing it was a camera panning over back towards the various dolls. However, instead of them all looking directly at me, they were all looking at the side of the room where Ruby had exited. I didn't know at the time what the hell was going on, until suddenly all the dolls slowly, and I mean slowly, moved their eyes back over towards the middle of the screen before winking at me. Yes, even the plush dolls on there did this as well. This was enough to cause me to go into a full panic attack. I know that sounds ridiculous, but come on, I was 9 at the time, and having to sit there and watch this for nearly 30 whole minutes while continuously looking at nothing but dolls, it's bound to do something, especially with the phobia that I have. And before anybody asks, why didn't you at least turn off the TV if it was scaring you that much? I couldn't. I seriously wasn't able to. You see, the television in my living room that we had was a very old one. It was extremely busted up, and I believe that we wound up getting it from Goodwill for cheap. And one of the major issues that said television had was the non-existent buttons on the bottom of the, TV. Not really sure if this was caused by a kid or somebody else who owned it before we did, but one thing that I do know of is that the TV itself couldn't be operated with any of the buttons, and thus the remote itself was ultimately the only way that the television could be, used. And of course, the remote was with my father at the time, so there wasn't much I could do. I couldn't pull out the cord or anything because it was behind a large set, and if I yanked on it too hard, it would very much break a lot of things, valuables that were in there. And I wasn't risking or wanting to get in any kind of trouble. Of course, the only thing that I could do after that was run up to my room and pretty much stay there until dinner time. Which, of course, my father wasn't exactly too pleased with because of that. Mostly because of the fact that I left the TV on when I wasn't watching it. And, of course, after I explained to him everything that I saw, he must have snapped or something because he basically attempted to try and beat the fear out of me with the biggest belt that he had on him. I'm honestly quite surprised that the beating itself was better than having to look at that episode. Now, like I said before, and like what I'm going to say now, I don't know if this episode actually existed or not. I haven't seen it come back on television at all, nor have I heard about it again from my parents either. But I know what I saw. But then again, it's very likely that this was just a product of my mind, or very likely another episode of the show that was airing that somehow started to get distorted as I watched it. I don't really know. Even then, though, with all that said, I have to end with this question. Has anybody ever seen this episode? Is there even an episode remotely somewhat similar to this one? Or was this all just in my head? I mean, personally, I'm leaning towards the latter option, but I'm keeping my mind open for any other bits of information that would possibly wind up proving this on in the near future. If I am proven correct, though, I guarantee all of you, I'm not going to look for it. I'm not going to watch it. I want nothing to do with it. I don't want to, and it's sticking that way. I just want to know if this episode is real or not. That way, I can finally put this entire situation at rest in my head for good. In fear and
widen, your mouth goes dry with each battered breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to leave, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will be from the fear-gripping horror-driven nightmarish gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only time will tell if you will escape this online hell. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because your nightmares will come at any day.